Comparative Education. Chapter 1: Introduction to Comparative Education. Today I will be discussing the purposes of comparative education and uses of comparative education. What is comparative education? Comparative education is a vast field of study. It does not only study the educational systems of other countries or confine itself to a single strict definition because it covers disciplines such as the sociology, political science, psychology, and anthropology of different countries. Another definition of comparative education is the detailed study of educational systems to find out how a people's values and beliefs affect their educational system and how to provide suitable education for those people. The field is a deep, critical examination of societal values and educational systems of other countries for the purposes of evaluating one's own system and refreshing one's own culture by adopting progressive aspects from elsewhere on the basis of comparison. According to Noah and Eichstein, comparative education is an intersection of social sciences, education, and cross-national study which attempts to use cross-national data to test propositions about the relationship between education and society and between teaching practices and learning outcomes. There is a close relationship between comparative education and other social sciences. It is the discipline where information about education and other social sciences intersects. Programs and courses in comparative education are offered in many universities throughout the world, and relevant studies are regularly published in scholarly journals. Comparative education has four purposes. First, to describe educational systems, processes, or outcomes. Second, to assist in the development of educational institutions and practices. Third, to highlight the relationships between education and society. Fourth, to establish generalized statements about education that may be valid in more than one country. Uses of comparative education. The first use of comparative education is what is referred to as educational borrowing. In this instance, comparative education is used to obtain solutions to problems plaguing us. Many educational questions can be examined from an international perspective. For instance, the question of what to do with girls that fall pregnant while in school can draw on the actions that are taken in various countries such as Zambia, where the re-entry policy was formulated and is being implemented to enable such girls to go back to school whenever they are ready. Comparative education in this area is used to borrow successful forms of education, ideas, and activities from other countries or regions to be adopted, and at times adapted to our own system of education. The second use of comparative education is to facilitate planning of educational programs, curricula, teaching methods, and activities. Studying case studies on various educational systems can facilitate educational planning both at national level as well as in the classroom. Before educational policies are made, policymakers need to evaluate the anticipated consequences of the policy, as well identify possible constraints. Studies of educational systems that share similar problems or those that have formulated policies to overcome similar problems provide information for learning the possible consequences. Country case studies on educational systems may provide data on what other countries are doing, planning, or changing in their educational systems, and thus provide invaluable information for decision-making regarding what to adopt, modify, or avoid. The third use of comparative education is to facilitate educational assessment or evaluation. Comparative education enhances evaluation of educational outcomes by showing us how we are performing in a particular area of education compared to other countries. And this evaluation ideally should go beyond performance in national examinations. NOAA in 1984 points out that comparative education facilitates the establishment of comparative standards. Descriptive studies provided by the country studies provide an opportunity to estimate a country's standing in relation to other countries on dimensions of education that are selected for analysis. He further points out that the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement is one such initiative that uses comparative education. Given the above uses of comparative education, the traditional users of comparative education have been the policymakers, curriculum developers, and educational scholars. The educational scholars usually are interested in widening their knowledge of educational philosophies and learning theories, as well as discovering the effects of various educational practices in various social contexts. A fourth category of users of comparative education ideally should be teachers. However, most teachers do not perceive themselves as users of comparative education because they associate comparative education with policy making and curriculum development. Thank you for listening.